India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan have been rivals since the moment they were created. In 1947, British India was partitioned into two states, mostly Hindu India and mostly Muslim Pakistan. The partition created huge population movements, religious violence, and a political wound that never fully closed. The biggest unresolved issue became Kashmir. Kashmir was a Muslim-majority princely state ruled by a Hindu Maharaja. Both India and Pakistan wanted it. After armed tribesmen from Pakistan entered Kashmir, the Maharaja joined India, and the First India-Pakistan War began. The First War lasted from 1947 to 1948. Indian and Pakistani forces fought across mountain roads, valleys, and towns, while the region fractured along communal lines. Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh were targeted in different areas and saw violence that forced communities to flee or be driven from their homes. Both sides saw civilians unalived or worse and villages completely emptied. The war ended with Kashmir divided, not settled. The rivalry is religious, territorial, and national at the same time. For Pakistan, Kashmir is tied to the idea that Muslim-majority regions should have belonged to Pakistan. For India, Kashmir is tied to secular nationalism, territorial integrity, and resisting separatism. The two countries have fought several wars, including in 1947 to 48, 1965, and 1971, plus the Kargil conflict in 1999. Both countries now have nuclear weapons, which makes every crisis more dangerous. Today, the line of control separates Indian-administered Kashmir from Pakistani-administered Kashmir. It is not an internationally agreed border. It is a military line running through mountains, forests, villages, and high-altitude terrain. The line is about 724 kilometers long, and parts of it are heavily fenced, mined, and watched by soldiers on both sides. Recent tensions rose sharply after a deadly 2025 attack in Indian-administered Kashmir. India launched Operation Sindoor against targets in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, followed by cross-border fire, air and drone exchanges, and a fragile ceasefire in May 2025. North and South Korea. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Korea was split along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupied the north, and the United States occupied the south. What began as a temporary division hardened into two rival governments, Communist North Korea and anti-Communist South Korea. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South, starting the Korean War. The war devastated the peninsula. Cities were flattened, civilians were displaced, and millions of people were unalived or wounded. China entered the war on the north side, while the United States and UN forces fought for the South. The fighting stopped in 1953, but the war never officially ended with a peace treaty. It ended with an armistice, signed on July 27, 1953, which created the ceasefire system that still holds the peninsula in place. The United Nations Command notes that the Korean Peninsula technically remains in a state of war because no formal peace treaty was signed. The border is the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The name is misleading. The DMZ itself is a buffer strip, but the areas around it are among the most militarized places in the world. Minefields, fences, guard posts, artillery positions, tunnels, propaganda sites, and surveillance systems all sit around a line drawn through one people. The rivalry is ideological, dynastic, military, and personal. North Korea built a closed communist state ruled by the Kim family. South Korea became a capitalist democracy after decades of dictatorship and rapid development. Each side claimed legitimacy over the whole Korean nation. Families were split. Defectors risked their lives. Border incidents, naval clashes, missile tests, and military exercises keep tension alive. Recent tension flared in 2024 when North Korea sent trash-filled balloons into the south, and Seoul started using border loudspeakers with news and K-pop. After President Lee Jae-myung took office in 2025, South Korea suspended and began removing the speakers, though North Korea stayed hostile to talks. Somalia and Ethiopia. Somalia and Ethiopia have one of the deepest rivalries in the Horn of Africa. The core issue is geography and identity. Eastern Ethiopia contains the Ogaden, a large region inhabited mainly by ethnic Somalis. Somali nationalists have long argued that Somali-speaking people should be united in one state. Ethiopia sees the Ogaden as part of its own sovereign territory. That clash led to the Ogaden War in 1977, when Somalia invaded Ethiopia, trying to take the region. At first, Somali forces advanced quickly. Then the Soviet Union and Cuba backed Ethiopia, and Somalia was pushed back. The defeat weakened Somalia badly and helped set the stage for later collapse, but the rivalry did not disappear. Ethiopia has repeatedly intervened in Somalia, especially against Islamist forces and militant groups. Somalia, meanwhile, has often viewed Ethiopian involvement as foreign domination. The border has never been just about land. It is about ethnic Somalis living under Ethiopian rule, Ethiopian security fears, and the question of who controls the Horn of Africa. A newer issue made the rivalry sharper: access to the sea. Ethiopia lost its coastline when Eritrea became independent in 1993. Since then, Ethiopia has been landlocked despite having one of Africa's largest populations. In 2024, Ethiopia signed a deal with Somaliland, a breakaway region that Somalia still claims, to gain naval and commercial access to the Gulf of Aden. Somalia accused Ethiopia of threatening its sovereignty. Turkey later helped mediate, and Somalia and Ethiopia agreed to restore diplomatic relations in 2025, but the basic problem remains. Ethiopia wants sea access. Somalia fears partition and encroachment. Thailand and Cambodia. Thailand and Cambodia have a border rivalry built around ancient temples and modern nationalism. The most famous dispute is around Preah Vihear, an ancient Khmer temple sitting on a cliff in the Dangrek Mountains. The temple itself is culturally Cambodian, but the land around it has been disputed because the border was drawn during the French colonial period, when Cambodia was part of French Indochina. In 1962, the International Court of Justice ruled that the temple belonged to Cambodia. Thailand accepted the ruling, but the surrounding land remained sensitive. The problem was not only the temple, it was pride, history, maps, and the feeling on both sides that the other was using the border for politics. Tension rose again after Preah Vihear was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. Nationalists in Thailand saw the move as a territorial loss. Cambodian leaders used the temple as a symbol of sovereignty. Troops were sent to the area and border clashes followed. The rivalry is not religious in the usual sense. It is mostly territorial, historical, and nationalist. Both countries are majority Buddhist, but Preah Vihear is a Hindu temple from the Khmer Empire, and that makes it powerful as a symbol of Cambodia's ancient past. In 2025, tensions flared again. A skirmish near Preah Vihear left a Cambodian soldier dead, after which Cambodia banned Thai goods and Thailand closed border crossings and restricted links to Cambodia. The dispute also expanded into a maritime argument in the Gulf of Thailand, where both countries claim a large offshore area believed to hold major oil and gas resources. By 2026, Cambodia had turned to a UN maritime conciliation process, while Thailand agreed to join but halted other bilateral talks, including land border talks. This border rivalry survives because it is about who controls the legacy of the empire, who owns the map, and who can claim the temples that still stand on the frontier. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia and Azerbaijan have one of the most bitter border rivalries in the post-Soviet world. The center of the conflict was Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous region internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan but historically populated mainly by ethnic Armenians. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Armenians in Karabakh pushed to separate from Azerbaijan and join Armenia. The result was war. In the First Karabakh War, Armenian forces gained control of Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding Azerbaijani districts. Hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis were displaced. For Armenians, Karabakh became tied to survival, self-determination, and fear of being ruled by Baku. For Azerbaijanis, it became occupied national territory and a symbol of humiliation. The rivalry is ethnic, religious, territorial, and historical. Armenia is majority Christian. Azerbaijan is majority Muslim, though the conflict is more national than purely religious. In 2020, Azerbaijan used drones, artillery, and Turkish support to win back large areas. Russian peacekeepers were deployed, but the settlement did not last. In 2023, Azerbaijan launched another offensive and retook Nagorno-Karabakh. more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians left the region, effectively ending the Armenian presence there after decades of conflict. Now the dispute has shifted. The biggest issue is the Armenia-Azerbaijan state border, and the question of transport routes through southern Armenia, especially the so-called corridor issue linking Azerbaijan to its exclave of Nakhchivan. In 2025, Armenia and Azerbaijan initiated a peace agreement and signed a joint declaration in Washington, but it still required final signing and ratification. DR Congo and Rwanda. The rivalry between DR Congo and Rwanda comes from geography, ethnicity, security, and the long collapse of the Great Lakes region. The deeper background is the Hutu-Tutsi divide in Rwanda and Burundi. These identities existed before colonial rule, but Belgian colonial administration hardened them into official categories and helped turn social difference into political hierarchy. After independence, power struggles between Hutu and Tutsi groups became violent. In 1994, Rwanda exploded into genocide. Extremist Hutu forces targeted Tutsi civilians and moderate Hutus. Hundreds of thousands were unalived in just a few months. The Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front then took power, and huge numbers of Hutu refugees, including armed men involved in the genocide, fled west into eastern Congo, then called Zaire. Rwanda saw those armed groups across the border as a direct threat. Congo saw Rwanda's later interventions as invasions of its territory. Eastern Congo became the battlefield. The region is huge, mineral-rich, and difficult to control. It has armed groups, weak state authority, local ethnic conflicts, refugee camps, smuggling routes, and foreign interests all overlapping in the same space. Rwanda says its main concern is security, especially armed Hutu groups such as the FDLR, which includes elements linked to the old genocidal forces. DR Congo accuses Rwanda of using security as an excuse to back rebel movements and expand influence inside Congolese territory. The most famous recent group is M23, a Tutsi-led rebel movement that first became widely known in 2012 when it captured Goma, one of the biggest cities in eastern Congo. It later re-emerged in the 2020s, seizing territory in North Kivu and threatening Goma again. Congo accused Rwanda of backing the advance. Rwanda denied it and pointed to hostile militias near its border. By then, eastern Congo was once again filling with displaced civilians, foreign pressure, and the feeling that an old war had never really ended. Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey have one of the deepest border rivalries in Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The history goes back centuries. Much of modern Greece was once under the Ottoman Empire. Greek independence in the 19th century was built partly against Ottoman rule, and the collapse of that empire left Greeks and Turks fighting over land, islands, cities, and identity. The rivalry also carries the memory of the Greek genocide, sometimes discussed alongside the Armenian and Assyrian genocides. During the late Ottoman period and the years around the First World War, Greek Orthodox communities in Anatolia and the Pontus region were subjected to deportations, forced marches, expulsions, and mass violence. Many died from direct attacks, starvation, disease, or exposure. After the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, the two countries carried out a massive population exchange. Orthodox Christians in Turkey were sent to Greece, and Muslims in Greece were sent to Turkey, with some exceptions. It made the border more stable, but also turned old mixed communities into national memory and grievance. The modern rivalry has two main fronts. The first is Cyprus. The island had both Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. In 1974, after a Greek-backed coup tried to push Cyprus toward union with Greece, Turkey invaded the north of the island. Cyprus has remained divided ever since, with a UN buffer zone through the island and through Nicosia, the capital. The second front is the Aegean Sea. Greece controls many islands close to the Turkish coast. Turkey argues that Greece should not be able to use every island to claim wide maritime zones that box Turkey in. Greece argues that its islands are sovereign territory with legal rights. That dispute affects airspace, territorial waters, military flights, continental shelves, and possible energy resources under the sea. Both countries are NATO members, which makes the rivalry unusual. They are technically allies, but their jets have intercepted each other, their ships have faced off, and their politicians regularly accuse each other of provocation. In recent years, the rivalry has moved into maritime zones, energy routes, and environmental claims. Turkey objected to Greek marine parks and maritime plans in the Aegean, calling them unilateral moves in contested waters. Greece said the projects were legal and environmental. The same argument appears around undersea cables and energy routes near Cyprus. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan inherited one of the most complicated borders in Central Asia. The problem goes back to the Soviet Union. Moscow drew borders through the Fergana Valley, a dense region of mountains, farms, roads, rivers, and mixed communities. When the Soviet Union existed, those lines were internal borders. After 1991, they became international borders. That turned local disputes into state disputes. The rivalry is not mostly religious. Both countries are majority Muslim, but Kyrgyz and Tajiks are different ethnic and linguistic groups. The real problem is land, water, roads, enclaves, and access. Villages depend on irrigation canals, pastures, and routes that may cross into the other country's territory. In some places, the border was never clearly marked. In others, maps from different Soviet periods gave different answers. The most dangerous area was around Batken in southern Kyrgyzstan, near Tajikistan's Sugd region. Clashes broke out repeatedly between border guards and local communities. In September 2022, the border dispute escalated. Fighting began after Kyrgyz and Tajik border guards accused each other of taking positions in disputed or demarcated areas. Within days, the clashes grew from small arms fire into a larger confrontation involving heavy weapons, armored vehicles, and shelling around the Batken region. Kyrgyzstan said Batken airport and border villages were hit. Tajikistan accused Kyrgyzstan of shelling its own outposts and villages. Dozens were killed or wounded, and civilians on both sides were forced to flee. The reason this rivalry is so dangerous is that the border runs through everyday life. A road, a water source, or a village edge can become a military issue. In 2025, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan signed an agreement to demarcate their shared border after resolving disputes over more than 970 kilometers of frontier. The deal also included reopening transport links that had been closed since the 2022 fighting. But for decades, this border showed how Soviet-era lines could outlive the empire that drew them, turning canals and village roads into national flashpoints. India and China. India and China share one of the most dangerous high-altitude borders in the world. The border is not fully agreed. Instead, large parts are separated by the Line of Actual Control, or LAC. China controls Aksai Chin, a high desert plateau claimed by India. India controls Arunachal Pradesh, which China claims in whole or in part as South Tibet. Between them are mountains, glaciers, roads, patrol routes, and soldiers operating at extreme altitude. The two countries fought a war in 1962, which India lost badly. Since then, the border has stayed tense, even during periods of trade and diplomacy. The rivalry is partly territorial, but also civilizational and strategic. India and China are both huge Asian powers with nuclear weapons, massive populations, and competing visions of regional influence. China is close to Pakistan, India's main rival. India is increasingly linked to countries worried about Chinese power. The border itself makes clashes easier. The LAC is not always a clean line. Chatham House describes parts of it as less a fixed border than a buffer zone with conflicting interpretations from each side. Patrols can enter the same area believing they are still on their own side. In 2020, tensions exploded in the Galwan Valley. Indian and Chinese troops fought in brutal hand-to-hand clashes, using sticks, stones, and improvised weapons. Firearms were restricted by agreements, but the violence still caused deaths on both sides. Since then, both countries have built roads, moved troops, and created buffer zones in some areas. Critics in India argue that some arrangements have reduced Indian access to places its forces once patrolled. In the end, both sides want to avoid war, but neither wants to look weak. France and Germany. France and Germany had one of Europe's deepest border rivalries. The roots go back to the lands between French and German power, the Rhine, Alsace, Lorraine, and the old frontier between Latin and Germanic Europe. For centuries, these regions changed hands, absorbed mixed cultures, and became symbols of where one world ended and the other began. The rivalry became sharper because France and Germany developed very different national memories. French identity was tied to Paris, the Republic, the French language, and the idea of a centralized state. German identity developed later through many kingdoms and principalities, with language and culture often mattering more than one capital. Border regions like Alsace and Lorraine sat between those worlds. People there could speak German dialects, live under French rule, attend Catholic churches, serve in different armies, and be claimed by both sides. That made them useful symbols. Each country could argue the land was naturally theirs. In 1870, Prussia and its German allies defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War. The German Empire was proclaimed at Versailles inside France itself. France then lost Alsace and part of Lorraine to the new Germany. That loss became a national wound. Alsace-Lorraine had French speakers, German speakers, Catholics, Protestants, industry, fortresses, and coal and iron resources. For Germany, it was a recovered German borderland and a strategic shield. For France, it was stolen land and proof of humiliation. The issue helped poison relations before the First World War. French nationalism kept the memory of the lost provinces alive, while Germany fortified the region as part of its Western defense. After World War I, France recovered Alsace-Lorraine under the Treaty of Versailles. After Germany defeated France in 1940, Hitler annexed the region again and imposed Germanization policies. Many Alsatians and Mosellans were later forcibly drafted into the German army, and after 1945, the border returned to France. The rivalry was not mainly religious. It was national, linguistic, strategic, and the humiliation each side remembered from earlier wars. What makes this rivalry different is that it eventually transformed. After 2 world wars, France and West Germany built reconciliation into the foundations of modern Europe. The 1963 Élysée Treaty made Franco-German cooperation central to the European project. Iran and Iraq. Iran and Iraq have one of the oldest border rivalries in the Middle East. It reaches back to the old frontier between Persia and Mesopotamia, and later between the Safavid Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, this was where Persian, Turkish, Arab, Sunni, and Shia power met and fought. Iraq was once part of the Ottoman world, while Iran remained the great Persian state to the east. Between the 1500s and the early 1900s, Persia and the Ottomans signed repeated border treaties, but the frontier was never emotionally settled. One source notes that between 1555 and 1918, the two sides signed 18 different treaties trying to define the border. The most important flashpoint became the Shatt al-Arab, the waterway formed where the Tigris and Euphrates meet before reaching the Persian Gulf. It mattered because it controlled river access to the Gulf, trade, oil ports, and national pride. Iraq wanted strong control over the waterway. Iran argued that the border should run through the middle of the channel. The rivalry was not only ethnic or religious. Iraq is Arab majority. Iran is Persian majority. Iraq had a Sunni-led Ba'athist regime ruling over a Shia majority population. Iran, after 1979, became a Shia Islamic republic that wanted to export its revolution. Saddam Hussein saw that revolution as a threat. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran after border clashes and disputes over the Shatt al-Arab. Saddam believed Iran was weakened after its revolution and could be beaten quickly. Instead, the war lasted 8 years. The fighting became one of the worst wars of the late 20th century. Trenches, missiles, chemical weapons, mass assaults, and attacks on cities turned the border into a grinding front. Hundreds of thousands were unalived or wounded. The war ended in 1988 without a clear winner. The border remained, but both states were damaged. Since Saddam fell in 2003, Tehran has gained deep influence in Iraqi politics, trade, religion, and armed factions. Iraq also still works with the United States, which puts Baghdad in a constant balancing act. Iranian-backed militias operate inside Iraq, while Iraqi leaders try to avoid being dragged into Iran's wider conflicts with the US, Israel, and the Gulf states. In 2025, Reuters reported that some Iran-backed militias were even considering disarmament to avoid escalation with Washington. Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine share one of the most important and violent border rivalries in the world. The roots go deeper than the Soviet Union. Ukraine sat between empires for centuries. Polish, Lithuanian, Russian, Austrian, and Ottoman influence all touch parts of what is now Ukraine. Its people developed their own language, Orthodox traditions, folk culture, and regional identities, especially across the steppe and the lands along the Dnipro River. One of the key symbols of early Ukrainian identity was the Cossack Hetmanate, a semi-autonomous Cossack state that emerged in the 17th century. The Cossacks fought Poles, Tatars, Ottomans, and at times allied with Moscow. But what began as alliance gradually became domination. Over time, the Russian Empire reduced Cossack autonomy and pulled Ukrainian lands deeper into imperial control. Russian imperial thinking often treated Ukraine as a branch of the Russian world. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine became independent with internationally recognized borders, but Russia never fully accepted Ukraine's movement away from its influence. The first major rupture came in 2014, when Russia seized and annexed Crimea after Ukraine's pro-Russian president was overthrown during the Maidan Revolution. Soon after, war began in the Donbass, where Russian-backed separatists took control of parts of eastern Ukraine. For Ukraine, this was aggression against a sovereign state. For Russia, Ukraine's westward turn was framed as a threat, and Moscow claimed it was protecting Russian speakers and resisting NATO expansion. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war turned the border rivalry into Europe's largest conflict since the Second World War. Russian forces attacked from the north, east, and south, while Ukraine fought to hold its cities, ports, and statehood. Russia tried to seize Kyiv quickly, but Ukraine held the capital and pushed Russian forces back from the north. The war then centered on the east and south, where Russia occupied large parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, while Ukraine fought to retake territory and keep access to the Black Sea. By 2026, Russia still occupied roughly 20% of Ukraine, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. Russia continued attacks on Ukrainian cities, while Ukraine used drones against Russian oil infrastructure and military sites. The front line remains long and unstable. Reuters reported in June 2026 that Ukraine had recaptured more than 600 square kilometers of territory since the start of the year, but described the battlefield as difficult and dynamic.